welcome everyone also from me. I'm Helen Kingstone and I'm one of the co-editors of the book, which it's wonderful to have you all here to discuss this afternoon. Jennie is co-chairing alongside with me, probably clicking lots of useful Zoom buttons just now, and you'll hear from all of us as you go through this next first half of the session of the workshop before we open up for some discussion, and really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and your contributions. So the first thing I'd like to do is really introduce the impetus behind the project that led us to this book that hopefully you've had a chance to look at a bit in advance today or might look at after today. So 1 second while I share my screen with you. So this project began out of really a shared feeling between me and Jennie, and I think a lot of others of us in this room, that the concept of generations is an important and a significant and an interesting one, but one that is often being overused and sometimes misused in media discourse, in political discourse, and in ways that are sometimes sweeping, sometimes divisive, sometimes unhelpful, but where we feel like there's enough that's worth saving in the concept, really, that we felt it's worth getting together to try to draw out a kind of more coherent, more precise, and more synthesized understanding of what we mean when we talk about generation and generations plural. And we also felt that there are really interesting scholarly debates going on in different disciplines, and also different debates going on, as I say, in the political sphere, in the policy sphere, in the media sphere, in the third sector, which weren't necessarily all talking to one another. So we were very glad and grateful to really kick off this project with funding from Wellcome, at that time still called the Wellcome Trust, which gave us a small grant, as it was called, a Humanities and Social Sciences grant, to bring together a network on the theme of generations, chaired by me and by Jennie. And I was based at the University of Surrey at the time, now at Royal Holloway, University of London. And really, the purpose of this network was to bring together people from across these various disciplines, across humanities and social sciences, and our two third sector partners. So International Longevity Centre UK, and we'll be hearing from Aaron at ILC later, and also BPAS, the British Pregnancy Advisory Service. The workshops were somewhat stymied by the pandemic, so that all but the first happened online, but actually that gave us some really great international and cross-time zone, cross-geographical conversations. So we held workshops on, first, thinking about familial generations, secondly, thinking about social generations, and then because all the workshops were now free online, we kind of went wild and had another couple of workshops, one thinking about intergenerational relationships, and a fourth one particularly honing in on generational identities and how these are shaped by and brought about by historical events. And coming out of that network, our first output really was a toolkit, or a crib sheet, perhaps better described, for talking about generations, which I'll give you a sneak peek of in a moment. And also, ultimately, of course, this book that we're talking about today, Studying Generations, Multidisciplinary Perspectives. Just to give you a flavour of some of the kind of early and outward-facing conclusions that came from our discussions, they really were crystallised in this crib sheet or toolkit, or whatever other good words you might want to use, Jennie, that we wrote really just at the tail end of the funded project itself. 5 questions to ask yourself if you might be thinking about using generations or talking about generations. And there's a link at the bottom of the slide to download this yourself on the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies web pages. Really, the 5 questions are: pause to think about, what are you talking about? Who are you talking about? Where are you talking about? Why are you talking about generations in the first place? And also to think who you're talking to. And really what we mean there is that it's always worth pausing to check that one really means generation, because there's actually sometimes a good chance that interlocutors might be talking actually just about much narrower age groups, let's say 60 to 65-year-olds, that aren't perhaps as broad as an entire social generation, or perhaps a cohort, a particular class of 1966, or sometimes generation is used in that loose sense really to mean a period of time, an era. we're really exhorting people to try to avoid overgeneralizing, because of course, as well as differences between generations, we see differences within generations. And as a result, it's also important not to use generational differences as a kind of a weapon or as a sort of blunt instrument to avoid talking about more complex intragenerational issues such as class and race and gender and others. Of course, it's also important to remember, and it's wonderful to have an international group here today, that generational patterns are often nation-specific, you know, and particularly a kind of Anglo-American model often gets superimposed on the rest of the world. The question about why we felt is important, because one of the things that we hope comes out of our project is for people to reflect on the way that generational differences don't automatically or inevitably produce antagonism, to be thinking about what else generations and intergenerational relationships can do. And finally, to never be thinking or talking to only one single generation by themselves, when it might be possible to be talking more broadly and bringing generations together into dialogue. So these were our kind of key takeaways from the first part of our project. The other really central outcome is, of course, this book, which not only is available in print, but also free for you to download and access and read in ebook copy, as I hope some of you have already been doing in advance here. And here is really the structure of the book, which also forms the structure for the first part of today's workshop, singular, as we'll be going through each, talking very briefly in quickfire format about, you know, what we've learned and what we think is important from our perspective in relation to the chapter we wrote and what we contributed. So as you'll see, the first part one of the book was really trying to write quite survey style chapters that introduce the position of this concept in sociology, in the humanities, in biology, medicine and history of science, and also in contemporary cultural studies as well. And then part two were slightly shorter chapters that are bringing case studies from different disciplinary perspectives to illuminate those ideas that were in part one. So that's the kind of structure for the next 45 minutes or so. And of course, as well as contributions from each of the chapters, we'll have a contribution at the end from Aaron here from the International Longevity Centre to give the kind of policy context on these questions. So we will turn to that now, which I think means turning first to Jennie to give us your perspective on generation in sociology. And while you do that, I will just post into the chat, everybody, so that you can see the three questions that we have asked our contributors to reflect on, and which it would also be really valuable to hear your take on in the latter half of this workshop. Over to you, Jennie, and I'll stop sharing. There we go.
Thanks very much, Helen. And a big thank you from me to everybody who's been involved in this project, from the Generations Network discussions through the pandemic years to the book, to Ellie and Charlotte, the Centre for Parenting Cultural Studies, for hosting this event today, and also to those involved in the new book series, Generations, Transitions and Social Change. I can see some of our international editorial advisory group here, and this is the first book in that new series as well. So we're very pleased by what we've started with this discussion, but it's all ongoing. So I'm just going to give a few thoughts about the generations concept in sociology. So generations is really used within sociology to make sense of ideas and actions in periods of social change. So it's kind of very like the general project of sociology, but in particular, it pays close attention to the problem of meaning making in a particular historical moment. So it's got a very kind of clear temporal focus. And I think this is what makes it kind of distinct from other aspects of discussions, which in sociology that more emphasize the kind of continuity of conflicts or inequalities. The generations concept is also something that I find very fascinating, in that it really interrogates the relationship between the natural and the social worlds. This was Karl Mannheim's contribution to the development of the concept within the sociology of knowledge. And he kind of talked about the way in which the natural fact of generational renewal, the fact that, there's one born every minute and people, die continuously. So that continuity comes to place limits on what experience is socially constructed, which is a very interesting thing, I think, for sociologists to think around. The contribution of the Generations Network. Well, I've made a bunch of new friends and I'm always really happy about that. So that was great. It was also amidst a lot of the fairly grim periods of lockdowns, it was a really nice way of spending that time to talk about something else. And I found it really valuable to start from other perspectives on the generations question as a way of building up a more holistic picture of what it is that we're talking about. And I guess the conclusion I reached was that, understood properly, the generations concept in history, literature, psychology, all of these areas has probably more in common than it doesn't, really. The problem is when it's used simplistically and reductively in a very one-sided way, which was, of course, that was the problem that we were attempting to engage with the Generation Network. And I think the challenge is ongoing, really, to try and keep bringing clarity to the concept of generation and how it can be used and what it can tell us without losing the nuance that comes with a deeper understanding. In terms of what we do next, I think we need to continue with that. It's interesting, the generations discourse does change subtly all of the time, but I think it still retains some of these problems of one-sidedness and divisiveness. I think it will be, well, one of the things I'm struggling to do at the moment is to work through precisely what is distinct from a generational perspective about the current moment that we're living in. Or maybe there isn't anything, I don't know. People talk about generation gaps all the time. Often temporal differences are kind of overblown in the generations talk, but are we living in a new kind of historical phase that gives a new kind of sense of the problem of generational consciousness? And those were some of the questions I tried to raise in my chapter. And I also think that it will be fascinating to continue with this work on the relationship between the biological and social relationships, because that seems to be a very live discussion in a number of areas of life at the moment, and that could be very fruitfully pursued. So thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. I think that means I'm next because I wrote the next chapter.
Oh, sorry, yeah, and I'm also chairing. I'm
Okay,
over Helen. Now we've got Helen.
Thanks, Jenny. Yes, I wrote the next chapter, which is about the humanities perspective on the generation concept. And I would say that from my position in the humanities, in an English department, but with a long-standing, interest in historical studies as well, really the familial and the biological sense of generation dominates, as I'm sure it does really across the board, because I guess that's our primary meaning for the term. And I think the social meaning of generation is a bit cast into shadow. I think there are ways in literary studies in which cohort meanings and social meanings of generation have been used in the past to talk about first and second generation romantic poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge and others, to talk about the generation of W.H. Auden in the 20th century, in Spanish studies, the generation of 1898, but all of these are really small elite groupings, of artists rather than more broadly across society. So what I'm really keen to do, and work I've been doing with Martin Hewitt, and he's been doing, and others, the historian who's here, is trying to assess the evidence to think about social generations more broadly in the part, and particularly to push back thinking about generations beyond the 20th and 21st centuries to see to what extent they're relevant further back in history. In terms of how this multidisciplinary project has contributed to my thinking, I found this one really hard to answer, actually, because I think it's percolated into me so much that it's hard to tease apart anymore. But I really value the opportunity it's given me to explore theory and scholarship in sociology and psychology and lots of disciplines that, you know, otherwise can be hard to, it's always hard to navigate disciplines outside our own, you know, until we get a toehold in them, I think. But I think, as I talk about a little bit in the conclusion to this book, being able to survey across these different disciplinary perspectives, I think, can give us insights into how the same terms and the same ideas are being talked about in different but informative and complementary ways in different places. So just to give 2 examples of that, you know, one is to think about the question of whether social generations are primarily identities, kind of self-imputed identities, or structures, you know, that are underlying and that might be unconscious or subconscious. And I think we can see across the book that different disciplines and different contributors are thinking of foregrounding either the identity question or the kind of structural question, but that clearly both things are often happening at once, or even when one isn't there, perhaps the other one is. And then the second thing really is about the amount of agency we have to control intergenerational transmission. Because in Nigel Williams' chapter, for instance, as I'm sure you'll come on to hear about, you know, Nigel's thinking partly about intergenerational transmission of trauma. And Tatiana, who you'll hear from in a video shortly, who couldn't join us because she's in New Zealand, is thinking about epigenetic inheritances. You know, this is intergenerational transmission that we can't often control. Whereas on the other hand, in Ali's chapter, she's thinking about different kinds of intergenerational interactions that can both be more reciprocal and more chosen, you know, opt-in and important. So the word intergenerational, you know, is another kind of sub-term that's everywhere, and which often is used separately to mean things we can't control, or things that, you know, we have to opt into. And it would be great to bring those 2, you know, discussions more together. So I think that answers also where I think we should go next. Yeah, I'll pass on, or Jennie, you can pass on to the next contributor now, which probably is Tatiana.
Brilliant, yeah, so thank you, Helen. So I am now going to try and share a video that Tatiana sent over, because it is New Zealand, where it is also the 15th of May, apparently, which is why the date on her slide is wrong. She asked me to explain this. It's not wrong, it's just New Zealand time. Helen, if you grimace at me if this doesn't work, that would be really helpful.
Sure.
My name is Tatiana Bokliash, and I am a historian of science and medicine, studying how scientists understood, investigated, and then communicated various issues around human development and heredity. I live and work in Auckland, New Zealand, which is why I can't join you in real time today. And I prepared a short presentation as my contribution to this book launch, structured around the 3 questions that Jennie and Helen asked. So the first question is, how would you describe the use of the generation concept in your discipline or sector? Now, the concept of generation was once key in biology and medicine, and it stood for procreation, or an act of the creation of a new organism from parental contributions and under the influence of the current environment. Now, when heredity became central idea in biology in the 19th century, then generation was replaced with reproduction. And horizontal generations were demoted from creative agents to passive vessels transferring the hereditary material. In the late 20th century, the environment returned into scientific thinking about heredity. And now this is usually described with the term epigenetics. And I showed on this slide some popular media interpretations of this science. Now, simultaneously, generation and a variety of related terms such as intergenerational, multigenerational, transgenerational heredity made a comeback in both science and in history of science. And I show here a cover of a book by a group of German historians. That is a very good example of this scholarship. However, much of this existing historical scholarship stops in mid-20th century. And so my chapter attempted to take this thread further through into the second half of the 20th century, looking at the work that psychiatrists grappling with the trauma and experiences of Holocaust survivors and their children, and up all the way to the very recent molecular science, which was trying to find explanations at the cellular level for the impact that the environments and experiences of our ancestors have on us. Now, the second question that Jennie and Helen asked was, how has this multidisciplinary book contributed to out of my thinking about generations? And as the introductory chapters in this volume show, the idea of generation always incorporated both biological notions and social meanings. Jennie, in her chapter, quotes Mannheim as he argues that both class and generation are kind of spaces that one is born into. However, only generation location is based on biological rhythm in human existence. And participating in this multidisciplinary research project was very inspiring for me, because it also led me to expand the range of sources that I used in my thinking. And in the end, it turned out that fiction, which is what represented in all of this book, really, became really a crucial and central point of my chapter. The last question that Jennie and Helen asked is what needs to be done in this area. And I just want to finish with a very brief point to say that in history of science, as in science, we're really only beginning to think through how the ways in which we think about generations, quite broadly, shape the way we study, what kind of research questions we ask about human development and heredity. And I anticipate that this is going to be a major research area. Just at the end to say thank you, and I hope to get some questions from you, maybe perhaps by email, since I'm not here. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Tatjana. Okay, and next up we have Alison Winch from Goldsmiths, University of London, who is going to talk about Alison and Ben's chapter on a conjunctural cultural studies approach to the millennial. Thanks, Alison.
Thanks, Helen. It's such a privilege to be part of this book and see generation being developed in lots of different interdisciplinary directions. And your work, Jennie, is really pioneering in this field, and I've been very influenced by your work, and Ben too. So thanks, Jennie and Helen, also for your introduction to the book, which is just really cohesive and looking at this sort of fracturing and obfuscatory sometimes concept and how it's used in different contexts. So in media and cultural studies, which is the discipline that I'm coming from, there is a move to look at generation in relation to the social and political forces that forge a conjuncture, which is what we look at in our chapter. And we found that the conjuncture and Mannheim's ideas of fresh contact, as you talk about in your chapter, Jennie, map on really effectively onto each other. So in this area, scholars might look at representations of discourses around generation. So they might look at representations in different media forms, for example, or in political discourse. Sometimes scholars will look at or critique forms of audience segmentation in relation to generation. But sometimes it's used in quite a common sense way in media and cultural studies and isn't interrogated as much as it could be. Other scholars might look at generation as a mobilizing force, for example, for left-wing politics. When I use it in my teaching with media and cultural studies students, many students find it helpful in order to understand their own ambivalence with this idea of generation. Sometimes it really helps explain what is happening to them in the contemporary moment financially, economically. It might explain feelings of anger, resentment, for example, through a generational lens. But sometimes also students also quite resistant to the term, well, they're resistant to the idea of being part of a Generation Z, or, you know, that sort of movement between identifying and disidentifying. So some students might not find alliances within that in their own age group, but for example, more with queer communities or intergenerational communities of colour, for example. So it's a very generative term to use in teaching. And I really appreciated the research and chapters in this book, and looking at the specificity of the term from different contexts and disciplines, what generation alludes to, what it points to, also what it hides. The work on intergenerationality by David Amagoni and Ali Summers, for example, and intergenerational projects, super interesting. And also the work on the multi-generational self, and how these chapters look beyond the idea of the individual in conflict, which seems to be sort of the defining identity of the current moment, and instead looking at interdependency, relationality, in and through time. And I find that really generative and productive. So in terms of thinking what to do next in the area of media and cultural studies, I think maybe looking at generation in relation to the asset economy, continuing the work of Jennie in interrogating intergenerational conflicts, so seeing more solidarities, looking at intergenerational inheritance, for example, and how that's classed and racialized. Another focus of generation could be in the intensely commercialized platform economy, for example, how generation is a key data point, and how that data point might, and the algorithmic governance around that might forge ongoing common sense or commercialized forms of generation. And also thinking about Andrew King's and Matthew Hall's chapter, and how the term generation can amplify a cisgendered heteronormative notion of time as a linear one, as one as progress. So the ongoing critique of a common sense notion of generation in relation to the queering of time, perhaps linking this to critical thinkers such as Black feminists like Saidiya Hartman, whose collectives or identifications and alliances disrupt this notion of a linear time. Bringing, for example, what Paul Gilroy calls in relation to the Black music of the diaspora, the past into the present. So thanks for the opportunity to speak and be part of this project, and, you know, to read this fascinating work that's being done in this area. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alison. That's great. Okay, so next up we have David Amagoni from Keele University, who is going to be talking to his chapter, Generative Fiction, Structures of Feeling, Placemaking and Intergenerational Contact in the Lido. David.
Thank you so much, Jennie. Good to see everybody. It's been really helpful to hear the introductions by other contributors, because it helps to frame one's own. And so just a few words about, you know, where I'm coming from, linked to some of the things that Helen has said so far. So a little like Helen and some other people on the call this afternoon, Andrew King, and I know Martin Hewitt is here as well. I'm a Victorian literature and culture specialist, so used to working more in the in a historical mode. This is very much kind of a present-centered chapter, because it looks at a piece of popular fiction by Libby Page, which was published in 2018, called The Lido. And I suppose you could see it's a sort of feel-good piece of contemporary fiction. What Helen indicated was that normally when we talk about generations in literary studies, we're often talking about elite groupings and so on, like first and second generation romantic poets. This was an attempt to think about generations from the perspective of the moment, writing popular fictions which inevitably inscribe markers of generational identity and generational feeling. And then one has a number of kind of possible approaches to this: the representation of generation, as Alison has just been indicating, but also the kind of analysis of authorial identity as part of a kind of historical generational sort of way of becoming and being. So both of those forms of generational thinking are in play in this chapter. What I do is to look again at the work of Raymond Williams, who was a notable cultural critic linking history, sociology, and cultural studies, and using, mostly in connection with kind of 19th century and earlier work, concepts of generations for understanding the kind of particular moments in which what he calls structures of feeling are produced. I look at that, and I suppose I'm trying to answer the question of whether there is, going back to something that Jennie mentioned right at the beginning, is there a structure of feeling? And my chapter of our particular moment, my chapter attempts to look at that in connection with ideas about placemaking and urban regeneration. So I'm exploring that topic. In terms of contributions to interdisciplinary work, I think this is a fabulous book. It stimulated my thinking. It was great to hear Tatiana a moment ago on history of science and medicine, because I do think that perspective that she's generating is of huge importance to the future directions of generational studies. How do we kind of anchor these notions in major kind of scientific and medical discourses? I use, for example, Bobby Duffy's book on generations to try and anchor some of my particular concerns around cultures of placemaking and urban regeneration, but also ideas about anxiety, experiences of anxiety, and mental health. And I think that's what's so important, to go on to the second question about how I'm using multidisciplinarity, or how I'm developing ideas about multidisciplinarity through the approaches taken in this book. For literary scholars, I would argue there's a really important impetus to try and connect our work to policy studies and thinking that directly kind of impacts on the present. And that is what I'm trying to achieve in this chapter. And where next? Well, I think more work on policy that particularly directs or embeds literary studies within questions of policy and practice, and which links us, which is another concern of mine at the moment, to some of the kind of artistic and programs of cultural regeneration that are so active in our urban centres. So it's an attempt to try and kind of resituate literary studies through the concept of generations in a kind of a wider field of work. Thanks very much, Jennie.
Well, thank you, David. Yes, that was great. Okay, Ali Summers is next. Ali is Chief Cultural and Engagement Officer at the David Posnack Jewish Cultural Center in Florida, USA. So we're really delighted to have you here on UK time. I've got no idea what time it is in Florida, but I'm always so grateful to international participants for fitting in with our time zones. Ali is going to be talking to her chapter, Intergenerational Engagement and Generational Identity.
Thank you. So I'm going to keep my comments as brief as possible. First, I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone. It was such a privilege. So I'm American and British. I was in Britain for 20 years. I've been in the States for 2 years. So I was at the in-person welcome research meeting before COVID. I participated through all the different COVID meetings, and I actually wrote my chapter as we moved back to the US, and we're moving back to the UK next month. I'm the odd one out on a number of levels. So I was an academic for a long time time at Goldsmiths, at City. And I also started the first intergenerational preschool at the grounds of a care home in the UK, and did a lot of research on intergenerational initiatives. So when I wrote my chapter, this is really important for the conversation we've had today, I was simultaneously doing a piece of research work for the World Health Organization. They had written their ageism strategy in 2021, and then they asked me to do an internal research piece looking at reviewing all of the systematic reviews of the evidence that was emerging on the impact of intergenerational engagement globally. And I want you to know that in the hundreds of articles that I read and reviewed, and at the same time, I was a research fellow at City, evaluating the largest ever England-wide intergenerational program with 4,000 participants. Not once did anyone ask or discuss the concept of generations. And I'm only giving you all of that background because the value of what this group of thinkers, academics, researchers, theorists, depending on where you are on the spectrum of how theoretical you are versus how practical and real world and present your work is, it cannot be underestimated. And actually, if I were to rewrite the chapter today, I would be looking at very different things. So I would resituate the work, because I was sort of coming from the ground up to meet everybody, and it was a new field, and I was trying to create the work where you could start to characterize the fervor of activity in intergenerational engagement globally. And actually, I think that answering Helen's questions that you posed, the 3 questions, I think that intergenerational engagement is really about non-familial generational engagement, and probably in many places is seeking to replace what historic familial structures did. When I did my global deep dive for the WHO, for example, and I mentioned it in one sentence in the chapter, almost nothing was out of South Africa or India, places where, in fact, there's much more evidence of families living together for many generations. Whereas those cultures which had a lot of current reports of age segregation and loneliness and fragmentation, you saw at the same time an explosion of intergenerational engagement. And that was all pre-COVID. So I'm even more curious to see what's happening now in terms of the activity. Some of the questions for me are, I don't want to take up more time, but I think generation as shockingly under-addressed in intergenerational engagement is used, and I talk about a little bit about this in the chapter, in two ways. One is to group a group of people together who are in settings that are not under their control, right? So in care homes, we often hang on to the notions of generational identity, and we look for historic markers to help people create a sense of community where they have no natural sense of community. And the same happens in a nursery all the time. And then you get people together of a particular age group, and you try to create a sense of community. And I would say that the use of generation is demographic, but it's also about resource exchange. And so, Helen, you alluded to this briefly when you talked about my chapter, but it's a very positive thing. But I would say it's been used in lots of different ways. So it's what do younger people have to help older people? What are their deficits that are being filled? And I guess in that way, it's meant to be reciprocal. But in terms of next work, I don't think we do anything properly theoretical in the intergenerational space. And I already have like 2 paper ideas just off the morning discussion of being with all of your lovely brains. So thank you very much. I'm sorry that wasn't particularly tidy, but it is shocking to think how absent generational discussions are in this brand new world of intergenerational engagement.
Well, thank you very much, Ali. And that insight alone, I think, is very powerful. And what we tried to do from the start with the Generations Network was to try and bring together these academic discussions with discussions that are very live and people working in the field of policy and practice. And I think your contribution, Ali, really showed what a valuable collaboration that was. Similarly, Aaron, who we'll hear from in a few minutes, from the International Longevity Centre, we had a wonderful experience working in partnership with ILC throughout this project. And I think we all kind of gained a lot of roundedness from that engagement. So thank you very much. Okay, next up we have Nigel Williams from the University of the West of England. And Nigel is going to be talking about a multi-generational self and a multi-generational society.
Thank you very much. I'm just getting this up on screen so I can see my notes. So this has been a very generous network and group, bridging a period of significant isolation through COVID. So a really important intervention, I think, by the network itself, for all of us in different ways. So multi-generational self and a multi-generational society, what on earth are these? So the use of the generation concept in my discipline, which is in psychotherapy and also psychosocial research, the issue that I explore in this chapter is that of social memory, and how the generations play a role in the way in which memory is transmitted and elaborated and lost over time. It's important to hold those kind of polarities between the creation and the loss of memory. This is a central issue in psychotherapy, and it has been really from the outset in the profession. So trying to understand the extent and nature of memory in the formation of individual and group identity, and it sheds light on trauma and how far back one needs to go to address PTSD and a range of problems and issues such as historically embedded victim-persecutor relationships. And that these are typically ones involved in slavery, genocide, racism, and other socially based dislocations and traumas. So migration being perhaps a very key aspect of that. One of the things that I have really had to tackle is the question of where memory is held, if not only in the individual, which I think is an implication of the generations being social. And in this chapter, I approach it through extended case studies, drawing on human stories that stretch across several generations and geographical spaces. So that's my kind of modus operandi. It's a kind of extended storytelling case study approach. But in the background, I hold the idea that's common to many First Nations peoples, that the generations form a sequence, a cycle, or a system where the contemporary self and society sit in a constantly moving midpoint between ancestral and future generations. And that perspective I find really helpful to return to in different ways. So how did the book contribute to my thinking about the generations? I've been challenged to think about whether a generation has to some degree to become self-conscious in some way, so that it includes memory to evolve from a cohort to that of a generational unit or system that can have social power and influence. Is this generational consciousness? And is this what allows a generation to become a unit and wield social power and influence? Fascinating ideas, and they were in some ways new to me, and through the chance of discussing them in this network has been really helpful. So the idea of post-memory, one generation crowding out another is a key obstacle for a society to becoming more fully multi-generational. I've really enjoyed the focus on intergenerational engagement, and we've just heard a lot about that just now. The capacity of the generations to collaborate not only lessens issues like loneliness, but the whole process of intergenerational care is a key part of any society becoming multi-generational and having a longer-term memory to hold problems around resolving issues around care, or what I call survival heuristics. So our implicit knowledge increases the more multi-generational we can be. What needs to be done next? Well, I'm very interested in the longer term. I found exposures to the ideas around epigenetics really useful as another way to explore how haunting seems to apparently hop across and through the generations. And I've developed an idea that I, at the moment, am calling transgenerational witnessing. And the idea that this can help to change historically stuck conflicts. Time will tell whether this helps us find new ways of making interventions in personal trauma and social conflict. But understanding the generations and their power is clearly a key part of this new understanding. So, thank you very much indeed. It's been a really interesting series of conversations.
Very much, Nigel. And I think the whole question of memory is something we might want to come back to in the discussion, because I am now remembering that during when we had our initial Generations Network discussions, this question came up quite a lot about memory, not just as an individual thing, but as a sort of a social memory, which particularly in rapidly changing times, assumes a great deal of importance. Anyway, next up, we have Andrew King from the University of Surrey, who is going to be talking about the chapter that he wrote with Matthew Hall, Rethinking Generations from a Queer Perspective. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks very much, Jenny, and also Helen, for both a fantastic network and book as well. It's really great to be part of. And good to see everyone here today. So I am a sociologist of aging and the life course, and as Jenny has very clearly outlined both in her chapter and today, generations have got sort of checkered history, I suppose, in sociology, and I think also have been sort of used and then misused and then ignored throughout sort of the history of sociology as well. As you can probably tell from the title of our chapter, Matt and I were undertaking a project on inequalities in the life course of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans and queer people. And being part of the network at the time really made us think in terms of generations and the question of generations in queer lives. And to our surprise, really, the concept of generations hadn't really been theorized or applied very much in LGBTQ studies. And so we wanted to think about that, and we wanted to look into that through our project. Also, we're very interested in theory and conceptualizations and very influenced by queer theory as well. So we felt that queer theory could speak to gaps, if you like, in this thinking about generations in queer lives. And so that's how we came to use the concept. In terms of being part of this book, I always think a multidisciplinary collection is a real opportunity for provoking ideas in yourself and learning from others. And certainly going through the book and also listening today has really made me think about that. You know, there are those moments where you think, gosh, that's really interesting. I really need to think more about that. Some particularly issues around trauma and memory and multi-generational selves as well. I think all of those could be really interesting for thinking about queer lives. And just in terms of our own sort of area where we might go next, certainly I think there's much to do in applying a generational lens to LGBTQ lives. I think generations are poorly theorized in queer studies. Although there are, as Alison was also highlighting, some sort of standout writers in particular. We think there's still work to be done in critiquing the inherent cis-heteronormativity of the concept of generations and its relationship with linearity and reproduction. And also, we've begun to move into sort of thinking in terms of intergenerationality as well. And Matt and I have run a study with Helen, which has been great to be part of, on intergenerational exchanges in LGBTQ communities. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy. And last but not least, we have Aaron Himawan from the International Longevity Centre, the UK, and she's going to be talking about the project. I'm thinking about how generations kind of fit with the policy context that we're kind of looking at the moment. So thanks very much, Aaron.
Thank you so much for having me on today. Let me first, start off by saying that I think this book is a fantastic contribution to the topic of generations. And I'm so glad to see that so many of the issues that were raised during the Generations Network appeared in the book throughout in various different ways and forms. And I think, that was really a fantastic initiative because it brought so many people together from various different perspectives to discuss this topic, and rightly so. I think, if anything, the book clearly shows how generations is relevant to so many disciplines, including in the area of policy. I think I'm probably respond a little differently than most people who have spoken before me on this, and that's mainly because I am coming from the policy perspective and I'm representing the third sector. But I think this book, really clearly shows that generations is a hugely political concept, and the term is very often used without much care as to the assumptions that it brings. And so from a policy perspective, and especially used in this way, it doesn't really help much in terms of advancing the conversation, and particularly around issues like inequity. Mostly I haven't seen it being used very well. And again, I think this book does help to demonstrate that one-dimensional approach that is a huge risk when policymakers use the term and when they apply it. But of course, it doesn't mean that it can't be used, right? I think the 5 questions for generational studies, which really clearly outlines how it can be used well, is a really prime example of how we can apply it in the right way. And I think certainly when talking about shared experiences that define a group of people, it can be very useful, especially as a starting point to generate a deeper conversation about life course and longevity. But I think the kind of problems that policymakers who use the term hopes that it solves are much too complex, and you can't just use one approach. So it is best used in tandem with other policy approaches. At ILC, so ILC is a think tank, we're a charity, and we look at the impact of longevity on society. And we've used the term generations in our work. We had 2 projects in particular that come to mind. One was our work on the Generation X and looking at retirement prospects for them. Again, it was a good way for us to get in front of the right policymakers by using the term generations. This is a term that policymakers love to use, but then for us to go in and talk about actually how diverse this group is, and particularly honing in on specific segments of the population, for instance, those who are carers, those who are low earners, those who are renters, first-time buyers, all of these issues that can obviously affect a person's experience. It might be different to what the norm of that generation people assume that they have, those experiences that they have. Another project that we did was specifically looking at whether intergenerational relationships can help improve health outcomes for older adults. And again, this was a really good example for a really interesting piece, because we were trying to better understand intergenerational relationships and help that inform wider policy making. And again, here it was very much understanding how these relationships work and whether they can be used to improve health outcomes. I'd say the key takeaway for policymakers is really to ensure that they recognize that this is an evolving concept. And I think this book does a very good job of reminding the reader of this complexity. And in terms of what happens next, I think I really want to ensure that policymakers don't make policy issues about the individual. And I think there is a risk of using a concept like generations as a way to pit generations against each other. In reality, doing so won't actually help policymakers in any way, because it's not helping redress the gaps in current policy. It's very much focusing on the individual and essentially blaming the individual. I don't think this is something that is always done with any perverse incentives. I think it's something that happens just by just not a very good understanding of the concept. So, I think, quite frankly, all policymakers would really benefit from reading this book. So that would be my one, other takeaway, I guess. And I would also challenge policymakers to think and consider not just old versus young generations, but generations throughout the life course. As we're living longer, there are many more generations that will be living at the same time. And it's really important to recognize and understand the complexities between different generations and how they all interrelate with one another.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Erin. All policymakers should read this book. Take note. Part of the reason we were so keen to publish the book open access was precisely so that it could be, shared as much as possible and people could kind of dip into the relevant bits. So please do feel free, everyone here, to recommend it to anyone who you think needs kind of a bit of a talking to on how they're using the concept of generation.